Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. We're glad you're here. Welcome to everyone to Financing Philadelphia's Future with Council Member Derek Green. This is a live question and answer about creating a Philadelphia public bank. We've been doing this for quite a while now, and we're glad you're with us. Today is going to be a little different in that we're going to have as many questions as we can from you. We have Council Member Derek Green and no guests. So the priority is the questions from you. So start putting those into the chat. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'm your moderator, Vanessa Lowe. I co-chair the Economic Dignity Team for Power, Philadelphians organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. I also host a radio show called Vanessa's Money Hour on Germantown Community Radio. So a couple of logistics. As usual, you'll all be muted throughout, but again, we need your questions. So enter those into your chat or your Q&A box starting now. And our hosts, Peter Winslow and Kyra Harris, will be capturing those questions and asking them. When you put in your questions, tell us, well, today it's probably going to be to Councilmember Green. As we go through, we may introduce some of the other folks who've been working on this though. So just specify who you're asking your question of. And also let us know what neighborhood you're from. All right, so we still only have 30 minutes, so we're going to jump right in. Let me go ahead and introduce our main person who's always here. Councilmember Derek Green is serving his second term.
Vanessa, just to save on time.
Okay.
I was just saying to save on time, maybe we can skip all the introduction.
Okay.
As I was looking at that photo, I looked a lot younger than I do now. This has been a very challenging project initiative, but I think we will get there in spite of some of the roadblocks and obstacles that have been put in front of us. But I am committed to getting and moving this forward. Because this is something that's very novel and new for not only the city of Philadelphia, but the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We don't have the good fortune like they do in California of having a General Assembly that create enabling legislation. So we are working through a lot of different fronts, fronts that are both on the public and the private sector. But we're going to continue to push forward in spite of the challenges and the obstacles that some may put in front of us, because we're going to move forward with this idea because I think the people have the support of this perspective. And I just wanted to say to all of those, especially those who have been core parts of the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition, thank you for all the time, the energy, the perspective, the emails, the phone calls, the conversations. I know it's been frustrating and challenging times, but I look forward to a point when we will see the benefit of this labor, not only now, but into the future.
All right. Well, Councilmember Green, we usually start with you give us a little bit of an update and then we'll go to some questions. We had a wonderful summit, so we might want to mention that
the summit was definitely one of the high points of this year. We're now really into the crux of working through the legislation. We are, going through a lot of different opinions and perspectives from various parties, from both the outside counsel, H&K, that we brought in to help us navigate through all the regulatory perspectives, the law department, which has, their perspective on certain things, and then our own perspective. So we are trying to really balance all of these issues. We are getting close to a final draft of the legislation. We still have some work to do, but I see us getting it much closer to that final draft so we can move forward with the legislation and really balance the needs and interests of what we're trying to accomplish, but also have some perspective of some of those outside barriers that may try to impact this legislation. But we're going to move forward in a way, from my perspective, because this is something that is new and different for the city, and getting people to think differently outside the box in ways that will help us move forward with this idea, in spite of some of the naysayers and others who would rather not see this legislation come to fruition.
Got it. All right. I'm going to quickly turn to Peter Winslow. Let's start with some questions, Peter. I think you have one to start.
Thank you, Vanessa. Councilmember Green, members of the Public Banking Coalition have referred back to our values, the original concepts that we had that we thought were very important for the bank. So the first question is, how will the public bank assure that its decisions, actions, and operations will be transparent?
Well, I think the way that occurs and, the way that we're looking at the structure of this organization is meeting certain qualifications. We talked about the values for board members and want to make sure that those values for board members are part of the entity that's going to control this authority that has the values in reference to economic development as well as justice that we've talked about from the original draft that was introduced, making sure that is part of the conversation, regardless who is appointing. We want to make sure that those individuals that have that background are going to be part of the leadership of this organization. And also making sure that we are putting into legislation areas that provide for that transparency and there's the opportunity to give people a perspective of what we're trying to do, because there are those who will say, well, why should the public sector have a bank? Look at what's happening in other areas. And so I think the way we're moving forward in the structure will create both the opportunity to benefit from certain laws like the Economic Development Finance Law, but also create that type of third party, but independence from the public sector, but still making sure that independence from the public sector has people on the board in the decision-making that represents the values that we've been talking about from the very beginning, even before the initial bill was drafted.
That was another question that came up was, how will the public bank assure that it will be independent and free from political control and influence?
Well, in order, we've had a lot of conversations about the Economic Development Finance Law, which is the entity that we're using to create, the state law, which is the framework we're using to create this entity, but then also trying to create it within the construct of a community development financial institution. In order to be a CDFI, you have to have independence from the public sector. And so working with H&K and working with some of the people as part of this conversation, creating that balance of we're creating a public entity, but also the independence to make decisions that the public is not controlling. And so the CDFI regulations require that independence away from the public sector. But at the same point, we have the public sector creating this entity because it's not a for-profit, but it is an entity created by the public for the values that we talked about. So that's been really the challenge dealing with one law, the Economic Development Finance Law, and also the Community Development Financial Institution characteristics and qualifications that require that independence. I'm trying not to get too technical, but it's somewhat horrible. We've been really in the weeds, the real weeds of this legislation, and some of the various nuances that we're dealing with.
So I want to give Kyra a chance. Kyra, do you have any questions yet? If not, I'll take it back to Peter.
No, not so much a question, just a statement from Deb. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I gotcha.
Okay, not so much a question, but from Deb Feigert, she just made the point of the public sector having a decades-long successful record of regulating I don't know if there's an opportunity to expand on that a little bit and what that may look like as it relates to the public bank.
And if I could just follow up on that, because I was received an article that was from the American Banker that we just got today from one of the attorneys from Holland and Knight, which was basically pushed by those in the banking industry, really criticizing the movement for public banking in California. We want to make sure that this entity is independent, but at the same point, we don't want others who will try to use that as an argument why we shouldn't have a public bank. It's interesting that those in the private banking perspective are saying, well, I'm concerned about a public bank because of checks and balances and oversight and independence. But how do we get into the recession of 2008? That came from a lack of clear underwriting, some actual greed, and putting people into products that they probably should not have been in, for this pure, simple perspective of greed. So yes, we want to make sure we are independent. We're going to have transparency, as Peter talked about, to provide everyone opportunity to see what's going on. But I would just say some of those, not people who are asking these questions, but some of those outside parties who really don't want to see a public bank are using that as an argument against a public bank. And those were some of the things that was in that article from the American Banker that I saw earlier today.
Got it. I'm going to ask a question because I think we're getting a lot of questions about this sort of like oversight and regulation. If the structure, as you hope it will exist, becomes the structure that exists, who would be the regulator? Like, would it be the FDIC? Would it be, who regulates a public bank? And I know this is all very new and maybe we don't know yet.
Well, I mean, in addition to the appointing power of the board members and the positive advisory board members for the entity, and we're also want to get a state charter, a banking charter. I mean, that's a goal to that's why this is so different, because we're creating a municipal entity, public bank, but also want to get a state banking charter. So that ultimately will go through the Pennsylvania Department Banking and Securities. And so that's something that has not happened before. I think we can make some real strong arguments why the public bank should be approved through that department. You know, I've spoken with Secretary Bake, others have spoken with him, although we have not had that specific question about can this entity receive a charter through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We hope to have that question, at least ask that question as part of another conversation. And we'll make the argument why we believe it should be allowed within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so that will provide another level of oversight from a state department responsible for banking, so, which I think is also important, because a knock on wood, hopefully we do get approved. There's certain requirements and characteristics that we would need to do in order to maintain a state charter. And that's things that can also be provided to the public, or provide access to that information to the public, either through website or other means.
All right, thank you. Peter, let's take it back to you. Question.
Councilmember Green, there's been a concern right from the beginning. How will the public bank assure that the powers that be, the big Wall Street banks and the sometimes predatory economic developers and so forth can't seize control of this institution for their own use and basically co-opt it or subvert its intention?
Well, I think that would be very difficult, just based on the characteristics and qualifications we are stating in the enabling legislation of a type of individuals. Well, the backgrounds that we're looking for individuals to be on the board. Now, there's always a possibility someone that had worked in environmental justice, who maybe worked on was part of a savings loan or some other type of community-based financial institution. For whatever reason, she decides or he decides to get some different perspective. But I think looking at type of qualification that we're putting into what we're looking for board members, will help to give a perspective that these are the type of people that we're looking for to stop that from occurring. We are looking also at, how individuals are appointed to the board and who has the power to remove those as well. So that's something that we will continue to look at. Ultimately, the challenge is, from my perspective, I'm not sure if individuals or those from the industry you talk about would want to be involved in this process, because from their perspective, they don't want to see it exist at all. So I'm not sure they would take the energy to get involved or try to take over something that they see as a competitor or competition to them. And I'm not sure how they would get onto the board based on how we're structuring this municipal entity, and if they would meet the qualifications needed to be a part of the board to even have the ability to do some type of takeover.
All right, Peter, or Kyra, do you have a new one?
Yes, another question from Deb regarding the bank's leadership. How will Philadelphia residents be able to provide regular input to public bank leadership?
That's actually a good question. I mean, I think, we're working on the enabling legislation to create this entity, but also there will need to be, other steps that the board puts together in reference to policies and bylaws. So from the perspective of having, most organizations have an annual meeting, but maybe also having it set up where not only is there an annual meeting, but, providing regular reports to city council by way of a hearing process that can provide that type of oversight. So there could be a multiple different ideas in order to provide that type of transparency, to give people a perspective of the activities of the public bank. I think about some of the other city-related entities, and we could use ideas from some of those other organizations and how they provide that type of information on a regular basis to citizens in the city of Philadelphia.
Peter?
There's a question that's come in from Stan Shapiro, who asks, we now know that the city law department has recently opined that in their view, the mayor must have almost unlimited power to pick who he wants to be on the board. Do you see yourself bound to follow that advice?
Well, we just literally learned that in the past couple of days that the law department has opined that within the economic development finance law, that the mayor has the power to appoint the board members of a municipal authority within the economic development finance law. We have had ongoing conversations over the years in reference to the executive branch power versus the legislative branch's power. And we'll continue to have that conversation. I am someone who, although I served in the law department as a deputy city solicitor, the opinion of the city solicitor, who is appointed by the mayor and confirmed by city council, is one perspective. We also have other perspectives. So I'm trying to, as I said before, work through a lot of different issues and dynamics in that regard. There's also the perspective that once we create this entity, and this is where I think a lot of the energy is really going to be needed going forward. That's why having conversations like this, the Vision Summit, is very important, because we're working through the details of the legislation. To me, the big hurdles that we're going to have to accomplish locally is getting the funding to get this started through the budget process. And that's going to take a lot of advocacy, as well as not only the funding for the operational dollars, but also the capital needed to fund this in order for us to go forward. And although city council can put dollars into a budget through our budget and process, our legislative process, ultimately it's the mayor that decides how money is spent. And so understanding that the solicitor's office and the law department made an opinion, I want to get some more perspective on the basis of that opinion and see how we can work through this so we can maintain the perspective that we want in reference to making sure that the board members on this entity reflect the perspective and the qualifications that were the basis of the values that Peter talked about earlier, but also help us to make sure that we are able to operate this going forward and getting through that next fight, which is, to me, a much bigger fight than what we're dealing with right now.
I'm going to jump in here with another question, because that definitely sounds like that's a big challenge. Has the city created other entities in the past that have been independent? Because that's it. I mean, it sounds like that's both a requirement for the CDFI fund, but also it's almost like what we need for it not to be, for the city to create something that doesn't belong to the city. Am I summarizing that well?
So that's a good point. So through a lot of the conversations we've had both internally with the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition and with Holland and Knight and the Law Department, all the other entities that have been created with a entity and a subsidiary. So you've got Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation and Philadelphia Authority for Industrial Development, a separate entity. We have the Accelerator Fund, which, Greg Heller from the Accelerator Fund, that's a new entity that will looking to get CDFI status. That is a separate entity than the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation, which is a private nonprofit. Even the Energy Authority, which is a municipal authority that's similar to the initiative that we're talking about, although it doesn't come under the, it does come under the Economic Development Finance Law, but they created a separate entity, which is the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation. So when you think back the multiple conversations that we've had on this conversation, that was based on meeting with these different groups from Greg Heller, Accelerator Fund, Emily Shapira, and Mary Rose Martellus in reference to the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation, to get a sense how they operate and created their entities. The majority of them have been separate, which creates its own complexity because you're creating something, a subsidiary. We're creating something new, and thought of creating something, another new entity creates another level of complexity, which we've worked and been working through some of those challenges as well. So that's why, like I said, on multiple levels, this is something very different from the perspective of a public entity that's we're creating as a public bank with the ability to do some of the things that we're trying to do, making sure it represents the values that we would like to see in this organization, and also trying to get a bank charter for a public entity. So on multiple levels, this is something that is just new. And so that's why we've spent a lot of time on really talking through these issues with the Holland and Knight, with the Law Department, with the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition, because there's going to be a lot of, and I said it before, naysayers, and I want to be able to say a lot of these issues, we didn't do this overnight. This wasn't just some, oh, let's just create a bank and get it started. This was been a very deliberative process from the very beginning, from the visioning summit that we had a few weeks ago, to last year's summit, to the work we did to draft the initial bill, to where we are now. So I think all of that work has been challenging, it's been frustrating, but I think will give us the fruits of our labor when someone says, well, what about this? Oh, well, we did this research. We talked with the Secretary of Banking. We did this conversation. We looked at this issue. Even issues like ethics. We had a conversation about how to make this as ethical as possible. And so having conversations with the ethics board and their general counsel, where will more likely have to have a separate bill that gives the ethics board the power to have oversight, or it may be by contract. So we've been looking through all of these various dynamics, so that way when people who have legitimate issues and questions, we can answer them. And those that are just raising issues for the purpose of trying to stop this process, we also have answers for that and workarounds from those obstacles that some people may put in front of us.
Okay, all right. So we've talked quite a bit about ethics and oversight, it seems like. Kyra, anything new on your side?
There are no additional questions in the chat,
Okay.
but
Sorry, go ahead.
I will just ask, just yeah, just a general, it is out there in the ether. How do we get this in front of people, particularly those who don't typically pay attention to politics? How do we let people know that this is here and that this is something that they can take advantage of, particularly if they might not happen to be a business owner? You know, what is the plan to let people know that this is happening?
Well, I think, this type of work helps to keep the information out there. I know in the Visioning Summit, there was a lot of attendees. You had representatives from different jurisdictions around the country who are also working on public bank initiatives. I know some of our local news media also covered that as well. But I think really once we finalize, and I think we still got some work to do, but I think we're getting there, finalize the legislative product, then we're really going to have to make that push within the budget process. Why dollars should be allocated for this? Because once again, you're going to have those who say, oh, well, we can do this through this existing organization. Or, why do we need a public bank? Because we've got a credit union and we've got this group and we've got that group. Well, to me, this work product and initiative is based on a gap that's not being addressed. And that's where I see the work and the education of the constituents in the city of Philadelphia to build upon the work that we have been doing in educating people. And we'll have to continue that work, especially as we go into next year in the budget process.
All right, it's 4:57. Peter, we may have time for one more question if you have one. I have one if you don't.
I do. Councilmember Green, how confident are you that given all these obstacles, we're going to be able to have a bill passed during the current session by the end of or the middle of December that will establish the bank, and so that the next time we have a Financing Philadelphia's Future program, which will be at the end of November, all the sausage making will have been completed, and we will have a bill that everybody can see.
I'm less let me make a slight caveat. I'm less concerned about the passage because a number of council members were co-sponsors, and I think they will rely, although I can't speak for them, will rely on the work that we've done when we lay out all of the conversations that we've had to get to this product. I think we are getting there. Not quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. So I think we will be able to get a product. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get a product that we can pass by the end of this year, because we've talked through a lot of the issues. I think we've settled a lot of issues. We still have some open issues to be settled. But I think I'm optimistic that we will get there. I don't want to make the analogy, although it seems at times similar to the legislation that's going on in DC in reference to reconciliation and Build Back Better. There's some aspects of that negotiation that I don't necessarily favor. We don't have those same dynamics in this perspective, but it is still a very complex piece of legislation. And doing anything that's new and interesting is often going to be complex. And it's going to be different. And I think that's the fact that it's been hard and not easy. There's a reason why that's been, because we're trying to do something new, different, and bold. So that's why I wanted to say, as I did in the beginning of this conversation, to thank you for all the work that people have put in for not only this year, not only last year, but a number of years to get us to this point. And I believe we will get to where we need to be in the end of the day, at the end of the day.
All right, it's 4:59, so we're going to close out. Thank you all for joining us. Councilmember Green, you want to say a quick goodbye?
Just want to say thank you all. This was interesting to not have a guest where I can ask them questions, because often I'm like, what about this? What about that? So, but this was good. I'm glad we did have this Q&A, because I think it's important to have that, especially after we had the summit. and continue to ask and reach out with questions that people have.
All right. Hopefully we will see you all next month. We're going to continue this until that legislation gets passed and then some. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
I don't know if we're still recording, but Tim is locked out. He can't end.
Yeah,
it.
we're actually still recording.
Okay.
Is someone able to? Oh, we may just have to leave.
Who's able to